I remember the exact moment the engine died. We were 3 kilometers from the primary objective, grinding through the ash wastes of a world whose name I'd stopped trying to pronounce after the first week. The Vox was screaming contradictory orders, shells were falling like Emperor's judgment, and then silence. Not the silence of peace, but the sudden, suffocating absence of the machine spirit's constant rumble that had vibrated through my bones for 11 months. The Leman Russ, our fortress, our home, our iron prayer to the God Emperor, simply stopped. In that instant, I understood what it meant to be truly naked on a battlefield. The crew didn't panic immediately. We were too well trained for that, too ground down by the Munitorum's relentless conditioning. Sergeant Valk, our commander, was already barking orders before the treads had fully settled into the grey dust. Grayan, our driver, was hammering the ignition runes with the desperation of a man trying to restart his own heart. Beside me in the turret, Ossen had his hands on the manual traverse, ready to crank the battle cannon by hand if needed, though we all knew what that meant. We'd get perhaps one shot before the enemy closed in. Below us, Mika and Prast were already checking ammunition feeds and muttering the litany of reliable function, their voices tight with the kind of fear that makes your throat close up. I was the gunner. Had been for 347 days, not that anyone was counting except me. Before that, I'd been a manufactorum worker on a hive world, whose designation I'd also forgotten, pulled into the Imperial Guard during a mass conscription that swept through our district like a plague. They'd tested us for basic competencies. Could you count? Could you follow orders? Could you tell right from left? And those of us who passed got sorted into specializations. I'd shown an aptitude for spatial reasoning, whatever that meant, and suddenly I was being trained to operate the targeting systems of a Leman Russ battle tank. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my civilian life assembling components for tanks I'd never see, and now I was sitting inside one, waiting to die. The ash wastes stretched in every direction, a monotonous grey expanse broken only by the skeletal remains of dead machinery and the occasional crater that could swallow a company of infantry. This world had been contested for 60 years before we arrived, ground down by orbital bombardment and chemical warfare until nothing remained but this toxic desert. The enemy heretics, we were told, though they fought with disciplined precision that suggested military training rather than zealous chaos, held a massive fortress complex 10 kilometers to the northeast. Our regiment, the 408th Lorien, had been tasked with cracking open that fortress. We were one of 30 tanks in the armored column, and we'd been making steady progress until the ambush. They'd hidden in the ruins of what might have been a small settlement, concealed under camouflage netting that matched the ash perfectly. The first indication we'd had was when Tempest, the tank 2 positions ahead of us, simply exploded. Not the dramatic fireball explosion you see in propaganda vids, but a sharp crack followed by the entire vehicle lifting 2 meters off the ground before collapsing back down as a burning shell. Then the Vox erupted with screaming and static, and suddenly we were taking fire from 3 directions. Anti-tank weapons, heavy caliber, professional work. The column scattered, each tank commander trying to find cover while maintaining enough cohesion to concentrate fire. That was when our engine quit. Grayan was still hammering the ignition. The machine spirit remained stubbornly silent. Through my vision block, I could see other tanks maneuvering, their turrets traversing to engage targets I couldn't see from our static position. Smoke was beginning to obscure the battlefield, dark columns rising from burning vehicles. The Vox had degraded into overlapping voices, unit designations blending together into meaningless noise. Sergeant Valk was trying to raise company command, but all we got back was static, punctuated by brief bursts of what might have been words. We were alone, in the middle of a battle, surrounded by our regiment. We might as well have been on a different planet. "Mika, get out and check the engine," Volk ordered, his voice carrying that peculiar flatness that comes from accepting an impossible situation. We all knew what he was asking. The engine compartment was at the rear of the tank, exposed to whatever was shooting at us. Mika would have to climb out, pop the access panels, and try to diagnose the problem while shells and las fire filled the air. The average life expectancy of a crew member outside their tank during combat was measured in seconds, not minutes. But the alternative was sitting here until something with enough punch breached our armor, and then we'd all die together, trapped in a steel coffin. Mika didn't argue. None of us would have. That was the thing about the Imperial Guard, they didn't train you to think about orders, just to follow them. He grabbed his toolkit, a battered metal box that had been passed down through 4 previous crew members, all dead now, and made his way to the rear hatch. I heard the clang of metal on metal as he worked the manual release, then the sudden increase in noise as the hatch opened. The outside world rushed in. The crack of weapons fire, the rumble of engines, the distant screaming that might have been human or might have been something else. Then the hatch slammed shut again, muffling the chaos, though not enough. Through the periscope, I caught glimpses of the battle's progression. A Leman Russ from another company, I could tell by the different turret number, was backing away from a plume of smoke, its turret traversing frantically. Small arms fire was stitching patterns across the ash, raising tiny grey fountains. Something large and dark was moving in the smoke, low to the ground. I tried to track it, but my turret was locked in place, dependent on Mika getting the engine running so we could restore power to the traversing motors. Manual traverse was an option, but it was painfully slow, meant for fine adjustments rather than combat maneuvers. The temperature inside the tank was rising. Without the engine running, the ventilation fans were dead, and we were essentially sitting in a metal box under a sun that turned the ash wastes into an oven by midday. Sweat was running down my face, stinging my eyes, soaking into the padding of my helmet. Prast was breathing heavily, the sound loud in the confined space. He was a big man, too big for the interior of a Leman Russ, and he'd lost weight over the months, until his uniform hung loose on his frame. Now he was wedged into his position, one hand on the coaxial heavy bolter's ammunition feed, the other gripping a support rail hard enough that his knuckles were white. Vulk was on the Vox again, trying different channels, speaking in the clipped code phrases we'd drilled endlessly. Nothing. Just static, and the occasional burst of someone else's transmission, cut off mid-word. The communications network had collapsed, or been jammed, or simply overwhelmed by too many people trying to use it at once. In training, they'd told us the Vox was the lifeline of armored warfare, the thing that turned individual tanks into a coordinated force. Without it, we were just mobile bunkers, dangerous but isolated. And we weren't even mobile anymore. The tank rocked slightly. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we'd been hit, but then I realized it was just Mika working on the engine, his movements shifting the vehicle's weight. He'd been out there for maybe 2 minutes. That was a lifetime in combat. I found myself holding my breath, listening for the sound of weapons fire that would mean he'd been spotted, the thud of a body hitting the ground. But there was only the general chaos of battle, too confused to pick out individual sounds. Grayan was praying now, his hands still on the ignition but his lips moving through the litany of awakening, the prayer meant to rouse a reluctant machine spirit. His voice was barely audible over the muffled sounds of combat, but I could see his lips forming the words, "Spirit of the machine, blessed by the Omnissiah, hear the voice of your servant. Wake from your slumber and grant us your strength. In the name of the God Emperor, whose will moves all things, I beseech you." Over and over, a desperate mantra. I'd heard him pray before we all had, but never with this raw intensity. He knew what I knew. If the engine didn't start, we were already dead. It was just a question of when. Ossen was staring at the manual traverse wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. He was younger than the rest of us, conscripted barely 8 months ago from some agri world where his most dangerous encounter had probably been with an angry livestock animal. The Imperial Guard had a way of aging people rapidly, though. The boy who joined our crew with wide eyes and enthusiastic prayers was gone, replaced by this hollow-eyed man who flinched at sudden noises and barely spoke except to acknowledge orders. Now he was contemplating the nightmare of manual traverse, trying to track targets while cranking a wheel that took 30 rotations to move the turret 90 degrees. Knowing that every second the turret was in motion was a second we weren't firing. Through my gun sight, still functional, running on the tank's auxiliary batteries, I watched another Leman Russ take a direct hit. The shell struck the turret at an angle, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then smoke began pouring from every hatch and vision port, thick black smoke that meant something inside was burning. The turret hatches popped open and figures emerged, wreathed in flames, falling from the tank to roll in the ash. I couldn't tell if they were trying to extinguish the flames or if they were already dead, their bodies just going through the motions. Either way, they stopped moving after a few seconds. The tank continued to burn, ammunition cooking off inside with dull crumps that made the hull jump. That was our future, I realized. If we couldn't get moving, couldn't get power to our systems, we'd sit here until something found us. The enemy's anti-tank gunners were methodical, I'd give them that. They weren't wasting shots on moving targets that might dodge. They were picking off the immobilized tanks, the damaged ones, the easy kills. We were next on that list. The rear hatch clanged open again. Mika's voice, hoarse and scared. "It's the fuel line. The main coupling's cracked, we're hemorrhaging promethium." Then the hatch slammed shut. Silence inside the tank. Everyone processing what that meant. The fuel line. Not something we could repair in the field, not under fire, possibly not at all without specialized equipment. The tank was done. We were done. Volk's voice, when he spoke, was steady. That was what made him a good sergeant. Even when delivering a death sentence, his voice didn't waver. "Prepare to abandon vehicle. Prast, Mika, grab as much ammunition as you can carry. Grayan, extract the cogitator core command, will want it if we make it back. Gunner, loader, prepare to provide covering fire on my mark. We're going to make for that crater, 300 meters northwest." Questions? No one had questions. What was there to ask? Could we stay in the tank and hope for rescue? No. Could we repair the fuel line? No. Could we call for support? The Vox was dead. Our options had narrowed to a single point. Get out and run, or sit here and die when the enemy's next volley found us. The Emperor protects, they always told us, but the Emperor helps those who help themselves. And right now, helping ourselves meant abandoning 47 tons of Imperial armor and hoping we could sprint 300 meters through a combat zone without getting cut down. I checked my las pistol, a pathetic gesture given that we were surrounded by heavy weapons, but it was something to do with my hands. The weapon was standard issue, barely maintained, probably wouldn't fire straight beyond 10 meters. I had 2 spare power packs, which meant maybe 40 shots total before I was reduced to throwing rocks. Beside me, Ossen was doing the same, his hands shaking slightly as he checked his weapon. We weren't infantry. We'd been trained to fight from inside a tank with centimeters of armor between us and the enemy. Out there, in the open, we were just meat. Prast and Mika were moving in the cramped interior, pulling open ammunition lockers and stuffing shells into bags. The battle cannon rounds were too large to carry, but the heavy bolter ammunition came in smaller boxes that could be manhandled if you were desperate enough. They'd slow us down, all that extra weight, but if we reached the crater and had to defend it, we'd want every round we could get. Grayan was at his station, working to extract the cogitator core, a process that involved disconnecting multiple cables and speaking the proper rituals to avoid angering the machine spirit. Even in extremis, even abandoning the tank, we had to follow protocol. The Adeptus Mechanicus would want that core, would demand it, and if we survived without it, we'd spend weeks or months answering questions about why we'd left it behind. The sound of weapons fire was getting closer. I could hear the distinctive crack of heavy bolters now, overlapping with the deeper boom of battle cannons. Someone was pushing forward, either us or them, which meant the line of battle was shifting. Good or bad, I couldn't tell. Maybe good, if it meant the enemy was being pushed back. Maybe bad if it meant they were overrunning our positions. The Vox stayed dead, offering no insight, just that hissing static that sounded like the laughter of uncaring gods. Valk had the rear hatch partially open, peering out at the battlefield. His body language tense, coiled, told me everything I needed to know. It was bad out there, maybe worse than bad, but we didn't have a choice. The tank was a corpse. We had to leave it before someone decided to make sure it was truly dead. "On my mark," Valk said, his voice pitched to carry over the noise. "Mika and Prast first, then Grayan, then Gunner and Loader. I'll bring up the rear. We move fast, stay low, no stopping for anything. If someone goes down, keep moving." "Understood?" We all acknowledged. That was the hard calculus of survival in the Imperial Guard. Individuals were expendable, but the unit had to persist. If Mika got hit, the rest of us didn't stop to drag him to cover. We kept moving, because 5 people reaching the crater was better than none. The Emperor needed soldiers, not heroes performing noble gestures over corpses. Grayan had the cogitator core free, a black box trailing disconnected cables like severed veins. He clutched it to his chest like a holy relic, which in a sense it was the machine spirit's memory, all the data from our months of combat, compressed into that armored housing. If we got it back to base, tech priests would extract that data, analyze our performance, add it to the vast archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus. If we didn't, well, the loss would be noted in some ledger somewhere, one more line item, in the Imperium's endless accounting of waste and failure. The explosion, when it came, wasn't even close to us, maybe a kilometer away, a massive fireball rising into the grey sky, mushrooming outward with the kind of force that suggested an ammunition carrier or fuel depot. The shockwave hit us seconds later, rocking the tank, and in that moment of general chaos, Valk made his decision. Go, go, go. The hatch slammed fully open, and Mika and Prast were moving, dropping down from the tank to the ash-covered ground, stumbling under the weight of ammunition boxes, but keeping their feet. Then Grayan, hugging the cogitator core, moving with the desperate speed of someone who knows death is measuring the distance. Ossen and I were next. I took one last look at my gun sight, at the familiar instruments I'd lived with for nearly a year, and then I was moving, muscle memory taking over, climbing down through the hatch. The air outside hit me like a physical thing. Hot, acrid with smoke and chemicals, filled with the sounds of war that had been muffled by the tank's armor. I landed badly, my ankle twisting on a piece of debris, pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Ossen was behind me, and behind him came Valk, and then we were all running. 300 meters. Doesn't sound like much, does it? The length of 3 football pitches, a short jog in peacetime, but with full combat gear, carrying ammunition, over uneven ground, while people are shooting at you, 300 meters becomes an infinite distance. The crater was visible, a dark depression in the grey landscape, maybe 5 meters across and deep enough to provide cover from direct fire. It might as well have been on another world. I ran. We all ran. Ash kicked up around my boots, each step threatening to twist my already injured ankle. Somewhere to my left, I could see the burning wreck of another tank, flames still licking from its hatches. Somewhere to my right, tracer rounds were drawing bright lines through the smoke. And ahead, always ahead, that crater that refused to get closer. My lungs were burning, heart hammering, the weight of my gear trying to drag me down. Behind me, I could hear Ossen's ragged breathing, could hear someone Prast maybe muttering prayers between gasps. 50 meters. The crater was closer now, its edges more defined. I could see that it wasn't just a crater but the remains of something. Chunks of twisted metal scattered around its perimeter. Maybe a tank, maybe something else. Didn't matter. It was cover. It was shelter. It was life. 20 meters. My legs were screaming. That ankle, threatening to give out completely. 10 meters. Almost there. Almost. The ground erupted to my left. A shell impact that threw up a column of ash and debris. The shockwave hit me like a fist, sending me stumbling sideways, barely keeping my feet. My ears were ringing. that high-pitched whine that drowns out everything else. I couldn't hear if anyone was shouting, couldn't tell if the others were still behind me. I just kept moving, driven by pure instinct now, brain shut down to everything except the need to reach that crater. And then I was there, tumbling over the edge, sliding down the loose ash into the relative safety of the depression. I landed hard, driving the air from my lungs, but I was alive. Alive. Others were sliding in around me. Ossen, landing with a grunt. Grayan, still clutching that cogitator core. Mika and Prast, their ammunition boxes hitting the ground with heavy thumps. And finally Valk, bringing up the rear as promised, his uniform torn, blood running down one arm from a wound I hadn't seen him take. We lay there for a moment, gasping, each of us doing a mental inventory of our bodies. I had my twisted ankle, various bruises, ears still ringing. But I was whole. We were whole. All 6 of us had made it. Against the odds, against every reasonable expectation, our crew was intact. It felt like a miracle, though I knew better than to think the Emperor had taken personal interest in 6 tank crew members. We'd been lucky. Nothing more. Luck was a finite resource on battlefields, and we'd probably just exhausted our supply. The crater provided good cover from direct fire, but it wasn't a defensive position. The sides were loose ash and dirt, unstable, impossible to fortify. There was no way out except the way we'd come in, which meant we were trapped if anyone decided to press an assault. And we had no communication with the rest of the regiment, no way to call for support or even to let them know we were alive. For all practical purposes, we were cut off, isolated, alone in the middle of a battle that was still raging around us. Volk was binding his arm with a strip of cloth torn from his uniform, working one-handed with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first wound. The cut looked deep but clean, probably from shrapnel. He'd be fine if we could get him to a Medicae within a few hours. If. That word carried a lot of weight. He finished tying off the bandage and looked at each of us in turn, counting, assessing. Everyone mobile? We all nodded. Good. Check your ammunition. Prast, inventory what we brought. Grayan, try the Vox, maybe the tank was jamming us somehow and we'll have better luck out here. Gunner. Loader. Watch our perimeter. We hold here until I can establish contact with command. It was a plan. Not a good plan, but plans in combat rarely were. I crawled to the edge of the crater, keeping low, and peered out at the battlefield. The smoke was thicker now, reducing visibility to maybe 100 meters in most directions. I could see shapes moving in the haze, friendly tanks, probably, or maybe enemy vehicles. Impossible to tell at this distance. The burning wrecks were clearer, at least 5 that I could see from this position. Pillars of black smoke marking their positions. Our Leman Russ was still visible, sitting dead where we'd left it, and as I watched, I saw movement around it. Figures, human-sized, moving with purpose. Infantry, either ours or theirs, checking the wreck. Grayan had the Vox unit out, a portable version that we'd grabbed from the tank, and he was cycling through frequencies. Static on every channel, that same meaningless hiss. He tried the emergency channel, the command channel, even the general infantry net. Nothing. Either the jamming was comprehensive, or everyone else was too busy fighting to waste time on communications. I found myself hoping it was the former, because the alternative meant the battle was going very badly indeed. Prast finished counting ammunition. We've got maybe 200 rounds for the heavy bolter, assuming we can set it up. Personal weapons are what we're carrying, couple magazines each. No grenades, no heavy weapons. If they push us, we won't last long. It was a bleak assessment, but accurate. We were tank crew, not infantry. Our weapons were meant for desperate last stands, not sustained combat. If someone decided to dig us out of this crater, we'd make them pay for it. But the ending was foreordained. Time passed. Minutes or hours, hard to tell. The battle continued around us, rising and falling in intensity like waves against a shore. Sometimes it seemed close, weapons fire crackling just beyond our limited vision. Other times it receded, becoming distant thunder. We took turns watching the perimeter, 2-hour shifts that felt like days. No one talked much. What was there to say? We'd abandoned our tank, completed our immediate mission of survival, and now we were waiting. Waiting for rescue, waiting for orders, waiting for the enemy to find us. Waiting was what soldiers did. Between the brief moments of terror, the sun moved across the sky, though the smoke made it hard to track. I realized I was thirsty, my mouth dry and tasting of ash. We had water, a few canteens we'd grabbed from the tank, but Volk was rationing it carefully. A sip every hour, no more. We didn't know how long we'd be here, and dehydration would kill us as surely as enemy fire. I wet my lips, trying to make the small amount of water last, and went back to watching the smoke. It was during my third watch that I saw them. Figures emerging from the haze, moving toward our position. I couldn't tell immediately if they were friendly or hostile. The smoke and distance obscured details, but they were coming this way with the kind of cautious advance that suggested they knew we were here. I alerted Volk, and suddenly everyone was at the crater's edge, weapons ready, watching those approaching shapes resolve into greater detail. They were wearing Imperial Guard uniforms. I could see that, much as they got closer, could make out the general outline of flak armor and lasguns, but uniforms could be stolen, and on this Emperor-forsaken world, you couldn't trust anything you saw until you could verify it up close. Volk had us hold fire, waiting, letting them approach until we could see faces, see unit insignia, see anything that would confirm their identity. 50 meters, 40. They were moving carefully, weapons ready, clearly aware that the crater might be occupied. Professional soldiers, then, not panicked stragglers. 30 meters, I could see their faces now, see the ash caked on their skin, see the exhaustion in their postures. 20 meters, Valk stood up, slowly, hands visible, and called out, 408th Lorien, tank crew, identify yourselves. The lead soldier, an officer by his shoulder boards, stopped and called back, Captain Theron, 408th Lorien, 3rd Company, lower your weapons, we're pulling back. Pulling back. Those words sent a chill through me. Not advancing, not consolidating, not holding position. Pulling back. That meant the attack had failed, meant we were retreating, meant everything we'd fought for today was for nothing. They reached the crater's edge and slid down to join us. There were maybe a dozen of them, all that remained of what had probably been a platoon. They looked like we felt, exhausted, scared, angry at the universe for putting them in this situation. Captain Theron was a thin man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, a souvenir from some previous battle. He looked at our small group and asked, "That your Russ out there? The dead one? What happened?" Volk explained, briefly, professionally. Fuel line failure, abandoned vehicle, made for cover. Theron listened, nodded, and then delivered the news we'd been dreading. The attack's been called off. We lost half the armor in the first hour. Ambush was worse than intel suggested. Regiments falling back to secondary positions. You're to come with us, integrate with my company until we can get you reassigned. It was all very matter of fact, very bureaucratic, as if we were discussing logistics rather than a defeat that had cost hundreds of lives. We gathered our equipment, such as it was, and prepared to move. The cogitator core, our ammunition, our personal weapons, that was all we had left. 47 tons of Imperial armor, 11 months of service, reduced to what 6 men could carry. It felt wrong, felt like abandonment, but that was the nature of war in the Imperium. Materiel was replaceable. Soldiers were replaceable. The mission was eternal. We moved out with Theron's group, heading northwest away from the fortress that had been our objective. The smoke was thinning now, letting us see more of the battlefield's extent. It was worse than I'd imagined. Tanks everywhere, dozens of them, some burning, some just stopped, crews dead inside or fled. The enemy had butchered us, not through superior numbers or better equipment, just through better planning and better execution. They'd turned our advantage, our armor, into a liability by choosing terrain where our mobility was constrained and their anti-tank weapons could dominate. We walked for hours, exhaustion making every step an effort. The captain led us through the ash wastes, following some route that existed in his head or on a map we couldn't see. Other groups joined us along the way, other survivors, until we were maybe 60 strong, a scratch formation of infantry and tank crew, moving as a single unit. No one talked much. We were all processing what had happened, all trying to understand how a carefully planned assault had turned into this shambling retreat. The secondary positions, when we reached them, were hardly positions at all. Just a series of shallow entrenchments dug into the ash, protected by whatever heavy weapons had been salvaged from the wreckage. But they were something, were better than being exposed in the open, and we collapsed into them with the gratitude of men who'd expected to die and somehow hadn't. Not yet, anyway. That night, huddled in a trench that smelled of unwashed bodies and promethium fumes, I thought about our tank. It was still out there, maybe 50 kilometers away now, sitting dead in the ash. Would they salvage it? Send a recovery team to drag it back to base, repair it, assign it to a new crew? Or would they just leave it, add it to the thousands of other abandoned vehicles that littered this world, let it rust and decay until it was just another piece of debris? I'd spent nearly a year in that tank. It had been my home, my fortress, my church. And I'd run away from it, left it behind without a second thought, because survival trumped sentiment every time. The Emperor protects, they always said, but the Emperor hadn't protected our fuel line, hadn't protected the 30 tanks that had burned today, hadn't protected the hundreds of men who'd died screaming inside their metal coffins or being cut down trying to flee. The Emperor, I was learning, protected nothing. You survived through luck, through training, through the anonymous chance that put someone else in the enemy's sights instead of you. And when your luck ran out, and it always ran out, eventually you died just as pointlessly as everyone else. We stayed in those trenches for 3 days. 3 days of sporadic shelling, of watching the horizon for enemy movement, of eating cold rations and drinking recycled water that tasted of chemicals. On the 4th day, trucks arrived to transport us back to the main base, and we climbed aboard with the mechanical compliance of men who'd stopped questioning orders. The base was chaos, thousands of soldiers milling around, officers shouting contradictory commands, the whole machinery of the Imperial Guard trying to reorganize after a defeat it hadn't anticipated. They separated us there, broke up the scratch formations, and sorted us back into our proper units. Or rather, they tried to. Our regiment had been mauled badly enough that half the companies didn't exist anymore, and those that remained were under strength. They assigned us to a temporary barracks, told us to wait for reassignment, and then forgot about us for a week. We spent that week in limbo, not part of any unit, not technically on duty, just existing in the gaps of the Imperial bureaucracy. It was during that week that I learned what had happened to our tank, not through official channels. No one bothered to tell us anything officially, but through the informal network of rumors and gossip that circulates through any military base. A salvage team had gone out, had found our Leman Russ, still sitting where we'd left it. But they hadn't recovered it. The enemy had found it first, had stripped it of anything useful, and then had rigged it with explosives. When the salvage team tried to approach, the whole thing went up, taking 3 recovery vehicles and their crews with it. Our home, our fortress, turned into a trap, turned into a weapon against our own side. I felt nothing when I heard that. Should have felt anger or sorrow or something. But there was just numbness, the same numbness that had settled over me in those trenches. The tank was gone. The crew was intact. That was the only calculus that mattered. They finally reassigned us on the 8th day. Not to a new tank, there weren't enough tanks left in the regiment for that. Instead, they handed us lasguns, gave us 2 hours of cursory training on infantry tactics, and told us we were now part of the 408th Lorien Infantry, 2nd Battalion, 5th Company. We'd gone from armored warfare to foot soldiers overnight, our months of specialized training rendered irrelevant by the simple expedient of not having any tanks to crew. Volk took it the hardest. He'd been a tank commander for 3 years, had built his entire identity around that role, and now he was just another sergeant in an infantry company. He didn't complain. Complaining wasn't the Imperial Guard way, but I could see it in his eyes, the loss of purpose, the sense of displacement. The rest of us adapted with varying degrees of success. Grayan muttered prayers to the machine god and clutched that cogitator core like a talisman, though no tech priest ever came to claim it. Prast and Mika fell into the physical routine of infantry life, with the ease of men who didn't much care what they were doing as long as someone told them to do it. Ossen seemed almost relieved, as if being outside the tank was somehow safer, though any infantryman could have told him otherwise. And me? I just carried my lasgun and waited for orders. Same as I'd waited for orders in the tank. Same as I'd waited for orders in the Manufactorum before that. Our new company was preparing for another assault on the fortress. Different approach this time. Lessons learned from the disaster of the armor column. Infantry would advance under cover of artillery, supported by remaining tanks held in reserve. It would be slower, bloodier, more grinding. But it would work, they told us. The Emperor's will would prevail. We'd been hearing that since day one, and it had yet to prove true, but we nodded and checked our equipment and prepared to advance. The night before the assault, I found myself thinking about that moment when the engine died. The sudden silence, the realization that our fortress had become a tomb. Everything that came after the run to the crater, the retreat, the reassignment, had followed from that single mechanical failure. One cracked fuel coupling, and our entire world had changed. That was the nature of war, I supposed. Everything balanced on knife edges and points of failure, and when something broke, you adapted or you died. We'd adapted. We were still alive. That had to count for something. But as I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the sounds of the camp around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd died back there in the ash wastes. That the 6 men who'd climbed out of that tank were already corpses, just going through the motions. The Emperor protects, they always said, but I knew better now. The Emperor demands, and we pay, and pay, and pay, until there's nothing left to give except the final payment of our lives. The assault went forward at dawn. We advanced in waves, thousands of us, lasguns ready, prayers on our lips. The fortress loomed ahead, massive and dark against the grey sky. Somewhere in the confusion of that advance, in the smoke and lasfire and screaming, I lost track of my old crew. Saw Volk go down, clutching his chest, blood spreading across his uniform. Saw Ossen take cover behind a pile of rubble, and then vanish when an artillery shell landed on top of him. The others just disappeared into the chaos, swallowed by the battle, and I never saw them again. I kept moving forward, because that's what you did. Kept firing my lasgun, kept following orders, kept surviving for another minute, another hour. The fortress grew closer, its walls pitted and scarred but still standing, still deadly. We were going to take it, Command had promised. We were going to crack it open and root out the heretics inside, no matter the cost. The Emperor's will would be done. But I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic or faith, that I would never leave this world. None of us would. We'd die here, in the ash and smoke, feeding bodies into the grinding machinery of Imperial warfare until the fortress fell, or we ran out of soldiers to throw at it. My tank had died 11 days ago. I'd been living on borrowed time ever since. The Emperor protects. They'd keep saying it, keep believing it, right up until the moment they learned the truth. The Emperor doesn't protect. The Emperor consumes. And we are all just fuel for that eternal, insatiable fire.